Coca-Cola, a brand everyone knows, is at the center of stories no one has ever told. Abandoned factories with hidden secrets, forgotten commercials that should never have aired, and a dark mystery surrounding the world's most secret formula. In these 5 terrifying stories, you will discover that behind the red and white arches, there is something much darker. Get ready to discover Coca-Cola's scariest secrets. The Coca-Cola Ghost Factory. The Call to the Factory. The Coca-Cola factory in the small town of Millbrook was, for decades, the beating heart of the community. Everyone knew someone who worked there, and production never stopped, maintaining the constant rhythm of the machines and the sweet smell of soda that spread throughout the city. However, 5 years ago, something strange happened. Without any warning, the factory was suddenly closed after a series of mysterious accidents. Henry, a former factory employee, received an unexpected call from an old coworker. "They want to reopen the factory," said the voice on the other end of the line. "And I need a team to run the place before it goes back into operation." Henry, who now worked as a security consultant, accepted the offer. The payment was too high to refuse, even if he knew there was something strange about the factory. In the days leading up to the closure, there were reports of unexplained specifics. Machines that turned on secretly, shadows moved on the walls, and, most disturbingly, the disappearance of 2 employees. Police never found traces of their whereabouts, and the factory was sealed shortly thereafter. Since then, the place has been empty, sunk into oblivion. Now, Henry and 3 other former employees have been called in for a full inspection. In addition to Henry, there was Mike, a maintenance technician who worked at the factory for over 20 years, Sarah, an engineer who knew every corner of the place, and Tom, the former manager, who always seemed to know more than he let on. That night, the group met in front of the old factory. The building, which was once a symbol of prosperity, has now become rusty and abandoned. The big red Coca-Cola letters still stood out high above the structure, but the familiar glow was gone. The factory was surrounded by an oppressive feeling, and even the wind seemed to whisper dark secrets through the broken windows. "Let's go in and get this over with as quickly as possible," Tom said, visibly uncomfortable. Henry agreed and, along with the rest of the group, entered through the large metal door that opened high. The inside of the factory was even scarier. The sweet smell of soda that once permeated the place was replaced by a damp, metallic odor. The machines were covered in dust, except that they had been used recently, which was impossible as the place had been closed for years. "This is weird," Mike muttered, as he adjusted his flashlight to better illuminate the dark hallway ahead. "It looks like someone was here recently." Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here, we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now. Hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. As they walked deeper into the factory, the noises began. First, there were small creaks, as if the metal adjusted to the silence that had lasted for years. But soon, the lighter children began to echo through the corridors. They were steps. Heavy footsteps, coming from somewhere ahead, but when the group reached the source of the sound, there was no one. Henry tried to remain calm, but the atmosphere of the place seemed to be changing. The air was colder, and the shadows on the walls began to move on their own, as if they were coming to life. He looked at Sarah, who was beside him, and saw that she was pale. "Do you hear that?" she said, her voice shaking. Henry nodded, knowing everyone was hearing the same thing. There was no doubt that they were not alone in the factory. "Let's go to the control room and check the system," Tom suggested. It could be that some equipment was accidentally reactivated. Tom's sound group up to the control room upstairs. The stairs leading up there were covered in dust and cobwebs, but the steps creaked as if someone had recently used them. When he reached the room, Henry moved away from the main panel and noticed that some of the monitors were working. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "The factory has been closed for years. There shouldn't be any electricity here." Before I could argue further, one of the screens showed something that made Henry's heart stop. On the monitor, security cameras showed a figure walking through the factory's empty corridors. The image was grainy, but it was clear enough to see that the figure was tall, thin, and dressed in an old-fashioned Coca-Cola employee uniform. "Who is this?" said Sarah in disbelief. "Is this live?" Tom looked at the monitors and shook his head, confused. "It can't be. There's no one here but us." The figure on the screens appeared to be walking toward them, moving with slow, deliberate steps. Henry tried to control his breathing, but panic was starting to take over everyone. Suddenly, the lights flicker and go out. The control room was plunged into total darkness, and the only sound was the rapid breathing of everyone in the group. When the lights came back on, the monitor showed something even more disturbing. The figure was gone, but the cameras showed deep damage to the walls of the hallways, as if something or someone had passed through recently, tearing the metal with force. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the place was abandoned, but now there was an oppressive feeling that they were being watched. That's not right," Mike muttered as he looked back. "This factory has been closed for 5 years. Who did this?" The silence that fell was suffocating. Sarah, who was next to Henry, was holding the flashlight tightly, her hand shaking visibly. The dim light of the flashlight seemed to be the only thing separating them from the total darkness that enveloped the factory. Suddenly, a screeching sound echoed through the halls. It was like the sound of metal being scratched with sharp claws. Henry looked at the monitor and saw that one of the cameras was showing something moving through the hallways again. But this time, the figure was closer. "Someone is approaching," Tom said, his voice low, as if he were afraid of drawing attention to himself. The figure seemed to be wandering through the halls towards the control room where they were. The creature's thin, disproportionate body was a dark shadow against the wall, but what really terrified Henry was the way it moved. Their movements were jerky, as if they were being controlled by invisible wires. The arms were too long, almost touching the ground, and the feet didn't even touch the ground. Mike looked around the room, looking for something to defend himself with. "I knew this job was going to suck," he said, his voice full of panic. "We have to get out of here," Sarah said, in a high-pitched whisper. "Now." Henry agreed, and everyone began moving quickly toward the stairs that led back to the lower floor. The hallway they were heading towards was long and narrow, the shadows allowed to move along with them. Henry kept looking back, expecting to see the figure appear at any moment. "Come on. We have to get to the exit before." Tom started to speak, but was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway behind them. Quick steps, as if something was running towards them. Henry didn't wait to see what it was. He began to run, followed closely by Mike, Sarah, and Tom. The sound of footsteps seemed to get closer by the second, as if the thing chasing them was just waiting for the right moment to attack. They rushed to the factory's main room, where the large production machines were covered in dust and rust. The room was vast and full of shadows. The big red Coca-Cola letters, which others had glowed with pride, were now faded and dirty, a distant reminder of an era of menace. Henry looked back, trying to find an escape route. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but the feeling that they were being watched persisted. The silence was oppressive, and the only thing they could hear was each other's rapid breathing. "We should go out the back door," Tom suggested, looking around nervously. "It leads straight to the parking lot. We can get in the car and get out of here as quickly as possible." Henry casually, but as they moved towards the door, they heard a strange sound. It was like a whisper, low and almost imperceptible, but it was everywhere. It seemed to come from the walls, the machines, every corner of the room. "What is that?" Mike said, his voice full of peace. Sarah mentioned to one of the production machines that it had inexplicably started operating on its own. The metallic clang of gears turning and conveyor belts moving was guaranteed in the silence of the abandoned factory. But there was something more. At the end of the production line, something was being moved out of the machines. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola, but instead of the familiar red and white label, the label was completely black, and the liquid inside appeared to be thick and viscous, almost like oil. "That doesn't make sense," Henry muttered, approaching cautiously. "There's no one operating these machines." When he picked up a bottle, he felt a strange chill run through his body, as if something had touched him. Suddenly, the voice grew louder, turning into a high-pitched, disturbing moan. He dropped the bottle on the floor, and it exploded, spraying the black liquid all over the concrete floor. It was then that they saw it. In the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows, was the employee I had seen on the cameras. He was closer now, and more details could be seen. The Coca-Cola uniform was torn and covered in dried blood. His face was a mask of horror, pale, with deep-set, lifeless eyes that watched them intently. "It's him," Sarah whispered. "It's the employee who disappeared." The man began to move toward them, but his movements were erratic, as if his body was being pulled by something invisible. The shadows around him point alive, twisting and stretching toward the group. Wasting no time, Henry comments, "Run." They ran toward the back door, the sound of the ghost employee's uneven footsteps echoing behind them. The shadows in the factory mostly come to life, reaching toward the group, trying to grab them. The air was freezing, and the feeling of impending doom was overwhelming. They reached the back door and pushed hard. It opened with a loud creak, and the group ran into the deserted parking lot. The silence outside was almost as oppressive as it was inside the factory, but at least it was far from that thing. Henry ran to his car, his hands shaking so much he could barely put the key in the ignition. Sarah and Mike got into the back seat, while Tom ran to his car, parked next door. They left quickly, leaving a factory behind. However, as they drove down the deserted road, Sarah looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made her heart stop. On the horizon, the factory was still visible in the distance, but there was something wrong. The big red Coca-Cola letters, which had been dim for so long, now glowed brightly, as if shining new again. And standing at the factory entrance was the ghost employee, watching them as they walked away. "This isn't over," Sarah said, her voice tremendous. "He's still there." The lost Coca-Cola commercial. The beginning of everything. In the 80s, Coca-Cola was always a pioneer in advertising campaigns. Their commercials were known for creating a sense of joy and nostalgia, but there was one, in particular, that didn't veer in that direction. This commercial aired only once, during a late-night break, and mysteriously disappeared soon after. Very few people saw it, but those who did claimed that something deeply disturbing happened to them afterward. The story begins with David, a collector of television relics. He was always fascinated by old commercials and would spend hours sifting through VHS tapes and lost archives, looking for forgotten advertising gems. One day, while searching at a flea market, I found an unlabeled VHS tape inside a box of old items. Curious, David bought a tape for just a few dollars and wasted no time heading home to watch it. He had a huge collection of tapes, but there was one thing that caught his attention. When I put the tape in the VCR, the screen was static for a few seconds before it started playing. The commercial started normally. Soft music played in the background, and the camera showed a bucket table in an underground park. Coca-Cola bottles were spread out on the table, with people around smiling and talking. At first, it seemed like a typical Coca-Cola commercial of the time, but something wasn't right. The video quality was grainy, and the cores were strangely washed out. Still, David continued to watch. Then, slowly, things started to get disturbing. The camera focused on a Coca-Cola bottle in the center of the table. As the camera slowly approached the bottle, the sound of the music became increasingly distorted, almost inaudible, as if it were being played backwards. Suddenly, the scene began to fall apart. The people around the table disappeared one by one without any explanation. The table, once full of food and drink, was now empty except for the bottle of Coca-Cola. David felt a shiver run down his spine. The silence in the room was absolute, except for the soft hum of the tape spinning in the VCR. He tried to pause the video, but the remote didn't work. He tried to turn off the VCR, but the device did not respond. It was as if the tape was in control now. The camera continued to focus on the bottle, but now something strange started to happen. A bottle of Coca-Cola began to move on its own, slowly sliding across the table as if pushed by an invisible force. David's eyes widened, but he couldn't look away. The camera then slowly panned, revealing the scenery around the table. The wet park was completely deserted. The trees, once full of life, were now dry and twisted, as if they had been burned. The sky, which had previously been a vibrant blue, was now a gloomy gray, with no sun, no light. It was as if all life had been drained from that place. As I watched, something began to appear at the bottom of the screen. It was difficult to see at first, but gradually it became clearer. It was a human figure, but completely disproportionate. His arms were too long, and his head was tilted in a way that looked unnatural. The figure stood on the horizon, watching, as a Coca-Cola bottle continued to move on its own. The figure began to walk, with slow and disturbing movements. David felt sweat running down his forehead, his heart beating fast. He knew there was something deeply wrong with what he was watching, but he couldn't stop. The figure got closer and closer to the camera, but with each step, the surrounding scenery changed. The deserted park began to disappear, and a cold, empty room took its place. It was a concrete room, lit by a single dim bulb suspended from the ceiling. In the center of the room was the same bottle of Coca-Cola. When the figure finally stopped, it was facing the bottle. David expected the commercial to end there, but it was nowhere near the end. The figure had no face. Or at least he didn't have a recognizable face. Where the eyes should have been, there were only deep shadows. The camera continued to focus on the figure, who was now motionless in front of the bottle. The sound of heavy breathing filled the air, but it didn't seem to come from the figure, it seemed to come from the bottle itself. David began to feel a growing pressure in his head, as if something was trying to force its way inside. He wanted to get up, he wanted to turn off the TV, but something was holding him in place. His vision began to blur, and he felt his surroundings change. The room he was in seemed to fill with a cold fog, and he could have sworn the air around him was beginning to smell like rusty metal. Suddenly, the figure on the screen moved, breaking the silence with a horrible bone-cracking sound. She reached out with her disproportionate hand and picked up a bottle of Coke, lifting it slowly. The bottle label, which had previously been off, now showed something different. Instead of the familiar logo, there were words written in a language David didn't recognize. As soon as the figure raised the bottle to its mouth, the screen went black. The sound of breathing continued for a few more seconds, and then the image returned. But now, it was something completely different. The camera showed a family sitting in a living room. Everyone was still, but their faces were distorted, with smiles too big to be natural. His hands were on his thighs, as if they were puppets, and his eyes were completely white. Next to them, on the floor, were several Coca-Cola bottles, all empty. The figure returned to the screen, standing behind the family. David began to feel nauseous. The scenario was so wrong, so out of touch with reality, that he felt like something was about to happen to him. It was then that he took a step towards the door of his apartment. David jumped out of his chair, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked at the TV, which was now static, and then at the front door. The knock was soft, almost like a light tap, but amidst the silence in the room, it seemed deafening. He stood still, not knowing what to do. His mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts, and the tape continued to spin in the VCR, as if there was still something more to show. The knock on the door sounded again, louder this time. David took a step toward the door, his body shaking, every fiber of his being telling him not to open it. But he needs to know. When he finally reached the doorknob, he felt the cold running through his skin. He opened the door slowly, and what he saw left him paralyzed. There, outside, was the figure from the commercial. Tall, with long arms, head tilted grotesquely. She was standing in the building's hallway, not moving, not making a sound. And in his hand he held the same bottle of Coca-Cola that he had seen on TV. David recovered, his legs almost giving out under the weight of fear. He tried to close the door, but the figure began to move, slowly walking towards him. The air in the hallway seemed to grow heavier with each step the figure took. The smell of rusty metal returned, stronger now, and the sound of heavy breathing filled the air. He managed to close the door tightly, locking it, but he knew that wasn't enough. The figure was there, on the other side. He heard the slow footsteps in the hallway, getting closer again. Not knowing what to do, David ran to the TV and tried to turn it off. The tape was still spinning in the VCR, and he tried to eject it, but it didn't respond. It was as if the tape was stuck, as if it was refusing to come off. It was then that he saw something even more terrifying. In the reflection of the TV screen, he saw the figure. She was inside the apartment now, standing behind him, holding a bottle of Coca-Cola. The creature's empty eyes watched him, and heavy breathing filled the air around him. David couldn't move. The pavement immobilized him. He felt the presence behind him, but he didn't dare look directly. In the reflection of the TV, the shadowy figure stood still, watching him in silence. The air around David seemed to freeze, as the sound of heavy breathing filled the room like an oppressive fog. He knew something terrible was about to happen, but before he could react, the figure began to move. Slowly, his long arms descended, and the Coca-Cola bottle in his hand began to drip a viscous black liquid. The ground around the figure seemed to absorb that liquid, as if it were taking on a life of its own. David tried to scream, but no one came out of his mouth. His body was paralyzed with fear, his eyes fixed on the reflection, watched helplessly as the figure advanced towards him. Every step she took seemed to drain what little energy she had left in her body. When the figure was just inches from David, it stopped. His eyes, or what appeared to be his eyes, were black, soulless holes. The figure slowly tilted its head and held out a bottle of Coca-Cola to him, as if offering something. David felt a wave of nausea pass through his body. The smell of rust and metal filled his nostrils, and he knew that if he accepted that bottle, something even worse would happen. But before I could take any action, the TV screen suddenly went black. The sound stopped, and the room was plunged into a deep silence. When David finally turned around, the figure was gone. The room was empty, as if nothing had happened. He stayed there for a few minutes, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The VCR finally stopped playing, and the tape ejected on its own. Trembling, David took the tape, his hands sweaty and shaking. He knew this was more than just a commercial. Still shaken, David decided to destroy the tape, certain that something evil was stuck to it. He ran to the kitchen, threw the tape in the trash and set it on fire, watching as the plastic melted and smoke rose. But even as the flames consumed the tape, he felt something wasn't right. The suggestions still echoed in his mind. And in the darkness of his apartment, he knew the figure was still watching. The lost Coca-Cola commercial had left its mark, and he would never be the same. The dark secret of recipe. The mystery behind the formula. For more than a century, the Coca-Cola formula was one of the world's best-kept secrets. There were countless theories about the ingredients, and the company always made a point of keeping this mystery. But what if the reason for so much secrecy was something much darker than simple commercial competition? Jack Thompson was an investigative journalist specializing in dark cases and conspiracies. After writing an article revealing unethical corporate practices, he became interested in large corporations and their secrets. That's how he decided to investigate Coca-Cola. For months, Jack investigated the company's history and interviewed former employees, trying to uncover the truth about the secret formula. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until he received a mysterious call from a former company chemist, who claimed to have information about the true origin of the recipe. The man, who insisted on remaining anonymous, arranged to meet Jack at a small coffee shop in downtown Atlanta, Coca-Cola's hometown. On the night of the meeting, Jack sat at a table at the back of the cafe, waiting for the mysterious informant. The place was almost empty except for a few occasional customers. When the man arrived, he was visibly nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the environment. He sent himself quickly and began speaking in a low, urgent tone. "You don't know what you're getting into," the man said. "The formula everyone knows, that's just the surface. There's something deeper, something they'll never reveal." Jack was intrigued. "What do you mean? Is Coca-Cola hiding something more than the recipe?" The man looked around again, as if afraid of being overheard. "There is a substance," he began, "an ingredient that cannot be synthesized, cannot be recreated. They call it the essential. The essential?" asked Jack, confused. I've never heard of that. What is it? The man swallowed. Nobody knows exactly. It's something that can only be acquired in specific places, and those who tried to investigate have disappeared. Jack felt a shiver run up his spine. Disappeared? What do you mean? You don't understand, the man continues, his voice tremendous. This is more than just business. There's something sinister behind Coca-Cola. I've seen things no one would believe. They're trying their best to keep this secret buried. Before Jack could ask any more questions, the man spoke up abruptly and left the cafe, leaving Jack with more questions than answers. He knew he was on to something big, something that could change everything the world knew about Coca-Cola. Determined to find out more, Jack began investigating old Coca-Cola factories and facilities. During his research, he discovered a strange pattern. There were several factories around the world that were suddenly closed without explanation, and in each of them, rumors of mysterious accidents and disappearances swirled around the facilities. Jack decided to visit one of these abandoned factories, located in a remote town in the interior of Mexico. The factory had been closed more than 20 years ago after what the company called operational problems. However, locals had different stories. They knew of workers who went mad, machines that ran on their own, and the mysterious substance known only as the essential. When Jack arrived at the factory, the first thing he noticed was its state of abandonment. The windows were broken, and the vegetation had contaminated the external walls. However, the Coca-Cola logo was still visible, half faded but present, like a ghostly mark of a past that should be forgotten. He forced open a rusty metal door and entered. The interior was a vast industrial room with old machines covered in dust and rust. The air was cold and heavy, and the silence was oppressive. Jack wondered how many secrets were buried in that place. While walking through the halls, Jack found something strange. There were boxes and boxes piled high, all labeled confidential and sealed with the Coca-Cola symbol. He opened one of them, and what he found stopped him in his tracks. At the bottom of the box, there were glass bottles with a dense, dark liquid without any identification. The essentials, Jack muttered, feeling the weight of what he was discovering. However, before he could ask more closely, he heard a sound behind him. Turning quickly, he saw a shadow move between the machines. Jack felt his heart speed up, but, firmly, he shook his figure. As he progressed through the factory, Jack realized he was not alone. The shadow he had seen continued to move erratically, as if it was guiding him somewhere. The hallway grew darker and darker, and the metallic smell in the room seemed to intensify. With each step, Jack felt a stronger presence, as if something was watching the shadows. Finally, he arrived at a room at the back of the factory. The door was ajar, and as he pushed it open, he was greeted by a disturbing sight. In the center of the room there was a metal table, and on top of it, vials identical to the ones he had found in the boxes. However, what caught his attention most was the large panel on the wall, covered with old documents and photos. Jack moved and began looking through the papers. They were old reports of experiments conducted by Coca-Cola itself. The photos showed the process of creating essential, but it was not something natural. Instead, a bizarre ritual seemed to be involved, with strange symbols and references to an entity that was supposed to be the source of this ingredient. While at the bottom, Jack began to understand the gravity of the situation. The essential wasn't just a secret ingredient, he seemed to be the result of something much darker. The familiar notes of sacrifices, rituals and a pact made by Coca-Cola's former leaders to ensure the company's global success. What terrified Jack most was the last line of one of the documents: "The essential requires souls." Suddenly, the sound of metal being dragged echoed through the room, and Jack turned to see the shadow again. But this time, the figure was closer, almost palpable in the darkness. Her eyes, two dots lined up in the middle of the shadow, were fixed on him. Jack backed away, tripping over the boxes around him. The sound of the approaching figure was relentless, as if it was dragging itself along the ground. He tried to run, but the room seemed to be closing in around him, the shadows becoming denser, or the air heavier. Panic gripped Jack as he desperately tried to find a way out. The figure continued to move towards him, its steps slow but inevitable. The air around Jack seemed to vibrate, and he felt as if something was trying to penetrate his mind, as if the factory itself was alive, pulsing with an evil energy. With trembling hands, Jack picked up one of the bottles with the essential and, without thinking, threw the liquid on the floor. The fragment severed, and the black liquid began to spread, producing a nauseating smell of sulfur and rust. To his surprise, the figure hesitated, as if being repelled by the liquid. Taking advantage of the moment, Jack ran towards the door, feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest. He knew he had to get out of there before it was too late. The walls seemed narrow, and the darkness around him seemed to come to life, trying to grab him. He ran through the factory halls, hearing the sound of the figure's footsteps behind him. The concrete floor echoed his hurried footsteps, and he could feel the cold intensify. When he finally reached the exit, he pushed the door with all his strength and ran out into the empty parking lot. The cool night air was a temporary respite, but Jack knew he wasn't safe. He got into his car, started the engine, and sped away from the factory without looking back. His body was shaking, and he could still feel the weight of the discoveries he had made. As he drove down the deserted road, the words from the documents he had read kept echoing in his mind. The essential requires souls. Back in Atlanta, Jack collected his thoughts. He had discovered something unimaginable, something that could destroy Coca-Cola's confidence forever. However, he knew he was in danger. Those who knew too much about the essential disappeared, and he didn't want to be next. Over the next few days, Jack began writing his article, detailing everything that had been discovered. However, as he was writing, he began to realize he was being followed. Strange cars stopped in front of his apartment, and strange phones came at unlikely times, with no one on the other end of the line. One night, as he was reviewing his notes, the phone rang again. He hesitated before answering, but when he did, a low, distorted voice spoke on the other end of the line. "You went too far." Jack froze, confirming the threatening tone. He knew this wasn't an order. Those who protected Coca-Cola's secret were wise to his discoveries, and now he was a target. That night, Jack took all his notes and burned them. He knew that no matter how much he wanted to expose the truth, the cost would be too high. Coca-Cola would continue to prosper, and the formula's dark secret would remain hidden, protected by forces beyond its understanding. But every time he drank a bottle of Coca-Cola, Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew that the essential was still there, hidden in the heart of the most famous drink in the world, and that those who guarded it were always lurking, ready to protect its secret at any cost. The ghost of the employee at the Coca-Cola factory. The last night shift. The Coca-Cola production plant in Birmingham, Alabama, was one of the largest in the country. It operated 24 hours a day, and night shifts were common to keep production high. Frank Matthews had worked there for over 15 years and knew every corner of the factory. He always preferred the night shift, as it was quieter and the silence helped him concentrate. But after that night, he would never work there again. It all started with hiring a new employee for the night shift, Eddie. He was a lively young man, eager to learn and quick to adapt to the intense pace of the factory. In the first week, he and Frank joined nearby colleagues, working side by side, monitoring machines and maintaining the production line. However, after a few weeks, something changed. Eddie started acting strangely. He was silent for long periods, looking at the machines as if he saw something no one else could see. Sometimes he mumbled to himself, as if he were talking to someone invisible. Frank began to notice these changes, but thought it was just the stress of work. That fateful night when everything fell apart, Eddie was even weirder than usual. They were at their posts, monitoring the machines, when Eddie started talking to someone. But there was no one there. "They're here," Eddie said, staring at one of the large bottling machines. "They want me to stay." Frank laughed, relieving the tension. "Eddie, man, are you okay? There's no one here but us." But Eddie didn't respond. He just continues to stare at the machines with a blank, distant look. Frank tried to focus on work, but Eddie's attitude made him uncomfortable. The atmosphere seemed heavier than usual that night. The machines made a constant noise, as always, but there was something strange in the air, something Frank couldn't explain. A few minutes later, Frank decided to confront Eddie. "Hey man, seriously, what's going on with you?" he asked, turning to his colleague. But when I looked over to where Eddie was sitting, the place was empty. Eddie was gone. Frank frowned and looked around. There was no way Eddie could have left without him noticing. The factory was huge, but footsteps echoed through the empty hallways at night, and Frank would have heard if anyone had wandered away. "Eddie," he called, waiting for an answer. But all that happened was the hum of the machines and the muffled sound of the ventilation system. Frank began walking through the factory, looking between the rows of machines. The fluorescent lights cast strange shadows on the walls, and the constant sound of the equipment seemed to be louder, as if they were trying to cover up something. He walked to the end of the production line, where cases of Coca-Cola were stacked for transport, but there was no sign of Eddie. It was then that something caught his attention. On the wall next to one of the machines, there were deep marks, as if someone had scratched the metal with their fingernails. Frank moved and ran his fingers over the marks. They were fresh, which didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be there but him and Eddie. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, Frank tentatively picked up his radio and called Eddie. "Eddie, where are you?" he asked, hoping that his colleague was just in another part of the factory. The radio crackled for a few seconds before an answer finally came. But the voice that came from the other end wasn't Eddie's. It was a low, distorted voice that echoed through the radio in a disturbing way. "He's with me now." Frank froze. This wasn't a joke. He looked around, trying to figure out where the voice could be coming from, but there was no one in sight. He turned off the radio. Panic began to form in his mind. Something was very wrong that night. Not knowing what to do, he decided to check the factory security system. If Eddie had gone somewhere else, like security cameras or captured. Frank went to the control room, where screens showed every corner of the factory in real time. He looked at the recording from the last few hours, looking for any sign of Eddie. And that's when I saw it. On the camera monitor that covered the production line area, Eddie was there. But he was not alone. Beside him, a shadowy figure with distorted contours moves through the shadows. The figure was tall and thin, with disproportionate arms and a face that could not be distinguished. Eddie seemed to be in a trance, following the figure as if hypnotized. Frank stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand what he was selling. That doesn't make sense. Who or what was that figure? He tried to enlarge the image, but the cameras got the result, flickering with static. It was then that he heard the sound. A loud, metallic creak came from the hallway behind him. Frank turned around quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, as if something heavy was moving through the factory. He walked out of the control room and began walking toward the sound, his hands trembling lightly. When he reached the main hallway, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. At the end of the hallway, where the darkness seemed thickest, he saw Eddie. But there was something wrong with him. Eddie was standing still, his head tilted strangely, as if he was trying to hear something. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, and her skin appeared paler than usual, almost translucent. "Eddie," Frank called, his voice tremendous. But Eddie didn't respond. He just continued there, standing still, as if he was waiting for something. It was then that Frank noticed the shadows. They moved around Eddie, dancing on the walls in a way that defied logic. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, twisting into bizarre, menacing shapes. The shadows do not reach towards Eddie, slowly enveloping him. "Eddie, get out of there," said Frank, his survival instinct screaming at him to flee. But Eddie didn't move. He simply stood there, motionless, as the shadows enveloped him. Moved. He simply stood there, motionless, as the shadows enveloped him. Frank started running towards Eddie, determined to get him out of there. But before he could get close, the shadowy figure he had seen on the cameras appeared in front of Eddie. She rose from the shadows like a specter, her form distorted and unreal. The figure was tall, with long, disjointed limbs. His face, or what should have been his face, was a blur of darkness, with no visible features. She moved strangely, as if she were floating instead of walking. Frank stopped abruptly, terror overwhelming him. The figure turned to him, and Frank felt his body freeze. His eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, were two dark spots in the darkness. They stared at him intently, as if they were sizing up his soul. "Let him go," Frank shared, although he reported that his voice sounded weak and full of fear. But the figure did not respond. She simply moved away from Eddie and extended a skeletal hand towards him. It was then that Eddie finally moved. He turned slowly, his eyes glassy and expressionless. Without saying a word, he follows the figure, walks towards the shadows. Frank stood there, helpless, watching as his colleague disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the factory and the dark entity that seemed to control the place. Frank felt panic as he came into contact with his body. He ran towards the factory exit, his heart beating wildly. But when he reached the main door, it was locked. He held on with all his might, but the door didn't move. It was as if the factory was trapping him inside. He ran to the windows, but they were all blocked by metal types. He was trapped. The sound of production machines once again filled the air, although no one was operating them. The constant buzzing was disturbing, and Frank felt like he was going crazy. He ran from side to side, trying to find a way out, but the factory seemed to be closing in around him, the shadows moving ominously in every situation. It was then that he heard the voice. "You're not leaving either." The voice was low and distorted, seeming to come from all sides at once. Frank looked around, trying to identify where she was coming from, but he couldn't see anything but the shadows. He felt his mind begin to waver, fear growing by the second. Suddenly, the factory lights began to flicker. The sound of the machines grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadows became denser, completely enveloping Frank. He tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the machines and the weight of the darkness around him. Frank fell to his knees, feeling despair taking over. He knew he was alone, trapped in the factory with something he couldn't understand. The shadows were getting closer and closer, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he was swallowed by them. It was then that he saw something that made him freeze in terror. At the back of the factory, among the shadows, he saw Eddie again. But this time, Eddie wasn't alone. Beside him, the shadowy figure stood, watching Frank with wide, empty eyes. The shadows around them seemed to writhe, as if they were alive, and Frank knew in that moment that he would never leave again. The shadows finally enveloped him, and the world around him went dark. Frank Matthews was never seen again. The cursed Coca-Cola bottle. The dark auction. At an antiques auction in Savannah, Georgia, a collection of rare objects was displayed, and among them was an antique Coca-Cola bottle dating back more than 100 years. A bottle, with a different design and a partially faded label, had been found during an excavation at an old Coca-Cola factory that had been demolished decades ago. Rachel, a collector of rare artifacts, couldn't resist trying to snap up a bottle. It was a perfect item for his growing collection of relics. She didn't know, however, that the bottle of wine had a dark past, a past that would begin to reveal itself as soon as she brought it home. On the day of the auction, there was a slight unease in the air as a bottle was served. A silent murmur went through the room, and one of the other buyers even commented, "I heard that bottle is cursed." But Rachel, skeptical by nature, laughed at the comment and made her offer, winning the item without much competition. That night, Rachel took a bottle to her apartment, placing it on a shelf next to other pieces from her collection. The bottle was beautiful in its simplicity. The glass was dark green, with an opaque shade, and the label, although worn, still partially displayed the Coca-Cola logo, in an old font she had never seen. But something about a bottle bothered her. She couldn't take her eyes off it, as if there was something else hidden beneath the surface of the glass. At night, when she was getting ready to sleep, she began to hear a strange sound coming from the living room. It was a soft sound, almost like a whisper, and it seemed to be coming from the direction where the bottle was. Rachel stood still for a moment, listening intently. The sound was low but constant, and it grew louder and louder. She called out, slowly walking into the living room. Moonlight came through the window, partially illuminating the room, and it was then that she saw it. The bottle was vibrating slightly, as if it were alive. Rachel stood still, staring at a bottle with wide eyes. She didn't believe in what she was selling. The glass shook gently, and the sound of whispering was now clearer, as if the voices were trying to come out from within. She moved, hesitantly, thinking maybe it was her imagination, but when she reached out to touch the bottle, it stopped vibrating immediately. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Rachel withdrew her hand, backing away slowly, her heart beating wildly. Unable to understand what had just happened, she returned to her room, trying to shake off the growing fear that enveloped her. However, that night, Rachel had the first of many nightmares. She dreamed that she was in an abandoned factory with old machines that rotated and made deafening noises. In the center of the factory, a line of workers stood, all wearing dirty, worn-out uniforms. But there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and their faces were deformed as if they were corroded by some substance. In the dream, Rachel was taken to the back of the factory where there was a large, rusty machine. From inside it, bottles of Coca-Cola came out, one after another, but the liquid inside the bottles was black, dense, and seemed to bubble as if it were alive. One of the workers handed one of these bottles to her, and when she held it, the liquid inside began to glow with a dim, ominous light. Rachel stood still, staring at a bottle with wide eyes. She didn't believe in what she was selling. The glass shook gently, and the sound of whispering was now clearer, as if the voices were trying to come out from within. She moved, hesitantly, thinking maybe it was her imagination, but when she reached out to touch the bottle, it stopped vibrating immediately. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Rachel withdrew her hand, backing away slowly, her heart beating wildly. Unable to understand what had just happened, she returned to her room, trying to shake off the growing fear that enveloped her. However, that night, Rachel had the first of many nightmares. She dreamed that she was in an abandoned factory with old machines that rotated and made deafening noises. In the center of the factory, a line of workers stood, all wearing dirty, worn-out uniforms. But there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and their faces were deformed as if they were corroded by some substance. In the dream, Rachel was taken to the back of the factory, where there was a large, rusty machine. From inside it, bottles of Coca-Cola came out, one after another, but the liquid inside the bottles was black, dense, and seemed to bubble as if it were alive. One of the workers handed one of these bottles to her, and when she held it, the liquid inside began to glow with a dim, ominous light. Rachel began her investigation by looking for the auctioneer who had sold the bottle. When she found him, he was reluctant to talk about the item. "That bottle has a complicated history," he said uneasily. "It was found in an old factory, and since then, everyone who has owned it has had problems." He said that a bottle had been passed around by collectors, and each of them reported strange and frightening events. Some heard voices at night, others resulted in nightmares similar to Rachel's. In one of the most extreme cases, one of the owners mysteriously disappeared, leaving only a bottle behind. Rachel began to feel a chill down her spine. "Do you know where it originally came from?" he said, his voice tremendous. The auctioneer paused before responding. "They say it was part of an experimental production that should never have left the factory. Something went wrong during the production process, and the bottles were all destroyed, or at least, they should have been." Rachel left the meeting with more questions than answers. She knew there was something very wrong with that bottle. There was a dark connection between her and the nightmares she had been having. But the more she investigated, the more it seemed like the truth was being uncovered. She decided to visit the site where a bottle had been found, a former Coca-Cola bottling plant, now in ruins, on the outskirts of Savannah. Maybe there she could find answers. When he arrived at the factory, the place looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The walls were covered in mold and rust, and the air smelled of damp and decay. Rachel entered through the main door, which was ajar, and the sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Inside, the silence was disturbing. The old production machines were still there, covered in dust and forgotten by time. Rachel walked through the dark hallways, her flashlight illuminating the remains of a lost era. It was then that she found something that made her heart stop. At the back of the factory, there was a warehouse. On the floor, several old Coca-Cola bottles were scattered, some broken, others intact. They all had the same faded label and opaque glass, identical to the bottle Rachel had purchased. But what caught his attention was a wall at the back of the warehouse. Engraved on the wall, in large, distorted letters, was, "They should never have been opened." Rachel backed away, the path growing into her chest. She knew she had touched something that should never have been touched. The bottles were somehow linked to a force far more powerful and ancient than she could have imagined. Suddenly, she felt a presence. The air in the factory seemed to grow heavier, and a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Rachel turned her head quickly, but there was no one there. The silence was broken by the sound of a bottle falling to the floor and shattering along. She started walking faster, her heart racing. But the sound of footsteps. Panic took over, and she ran through the hallways, trying to find the exit. When she reached the main door, she pushed it with all her strength, but the door didn't budge. It was as if she was locked, or worse, as if something was preventing her from escaping. Rachel turned and saw a figure in the hallway. The tall, distorted shadow slowly approaches, its elongated hands dragging across the ground. The stories were broadcast again, filling the air with incomprehensible words, but Rachel knew they were calling to her. She ran to the back of the factory, trying to find another exit. It was then that she saw a locked room with a small window that looked out. Without thinking twice, she broke down the door and jumped through the window, landing outside. The night was cold, and the cool air enveloped her as she ran to her car. When I finally managed to start the engine, I looked back and saw the shadow standing at the factory door, watching her. The figure was not the sound one, but the suggestions echoed in his mind. Back at her apartment, Rachel tried to have fun. But the events of that night never left his mind. She knew the bottle was connected to something supernatural, something she had triggered by bringing it into her home. She decided the only way to stop it was to destroy a bottle. She took a bottle and went to the basement of the building, where there was an incinerator. Without hesitation, she threw a bottle into the fire and watched as the glass began to melt. But even as the flames consumed a bottle, Rachel felt she wasn't alone. The sound of voices returned, louder now, and the lights in the basement began to flicker. When I looked back, the shadow was there, watching her again. Rachel realized, at that moment, that destroying a bottle wouldn't be enough. The evil that had been trapped in her was now loose, and she had become the target. In the days that followed, the nightmares got worse. The figures from the factory began to appear in her dreams more frequently, and the shadow never leaves her alone. She knew that wherever she went, that was next. The bottle's curse had been unleashed, and now, Rachel would have to face the consequences. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.